to this edition of NHSTalks Stories. It's a collaboration between the National Hellenic Society, our missions to preserve Hellenic heritage here in America, and the beautiful National Hellenic Museum in Chicago. And this is our stories collaboration is a chronicle of the Greek American story. And I'm so pleased to have Maureen Connors Santelli, a professor at Northern Virginia Community College. Very briefly, she hails from the University of Montana, from Montana originally. She received her BA in classics and history at the University of Montana. She received her master's from where my daughter attended, George Mason University, as well as her PhD. Her dissertation is the subject of this incredible book that we'll delve into called Greek Fire, the Greek Fire, American-Ottoman Relations and Democratic Fervor in the Age of Revolutions. And her book, I'm going to quote a little bit from her book, but Dr. Santelli's book, Maureen, if I may, points out the important voices from the past about the impact of the abolition of slavery in the United States could not have happened without the influence of the Greek War of Independence and the shadow it cast on the hypocrisy of slavery in America and the subjugation of women. So with that, let's just dive right into the discussion. Welcome, Maureen, or Dr. Santelli. Can you tell us a little bit about how you entered our Greek world? How did you enter this fascinating topic that I'm sure many of our viewers will hear about from the first time, and a little bit about your own story?
Yes. So thank you, first of all, for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm of course not culturally Greek or ethnically Greek. I came to the topic, it's kind of a long road that I won't go into all of the details because we'll be here for quite some time, but I was born and raised in Billings, Montana. I took Latin in high school, and for people who aren't familiar, the focus for studying classical languages, because they're not modern languages, we don't speak them, it's more of a philological approach, meaning you come at it from the vantage point of the culture of the ancients, their beliefs, their impact on society. And so it's not just the language, it's much more than that. And I fell in love with first the Romans, went to the University of Montana, Missoula, as you were just saying, and thought I was going to become a high school Latin teacher, which of course did not end up happening. I have kind of a very sort of a varied professional background because I kept wanting to do classics, but I took a class in American history and was just like, I want to bring these two together, but I'm not sure how to do that. So I ended up being accepted George Mason for graduate school, and was really struggling with not getting to do the classics because and especially since that summer before I came to Virginia in 2006, I went to Athens for the first time, and I spent more than a week just traveling around Greece, seeing all of the ancient sites that I had learned about in my ancient history classes, ancient philosophy classes. And ultimately I ended up interning with the First Federal Congress Project, which is out of George Washington University. And what they had me doing was kind of grunt work, but I had to help them do the proofs on their final copies before they went to press. And so I had to read public opinion articles out loud. And I was just bowled over by how much classical reference was in these just public opinion articles. These aren't even necessarily the most educated elites. These are people that, sure, they're literate, but are publishing or putting articles in newspapers. So my master's thesis was on the classical influence on the First Federal Congress Project, or First Federal Congress, excuse me, through these newspaper articles. And then when I moved on to the PhD, I wanted to do more with that that combination, and just in researching, how do we end up with more of an influence of the Greeks by the 1820s, because there definitely is a transition towards this heavier influence in Greek history. And so in looking in that's what brought me to the Greek War for Independence. And once again, bowled over by the overwhelming enthusiasm that I found in the newspapers. That's kind of like, that's my square one always. I go to the newspapers to see what people are saying. And it's just hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of articles being published at that time in support of Greece. So I knew I had found my topic. So that's what brought me to this.
And what were some of the early source materials, Maureen, that you used?
So again, initially it was a lot of newspapers. I used newspapers. I tried to be as broad as possible, using newspapers from Massachusetts all the way down to Georgia. And the topic did not disappoint. I mean, I found them everywhere. Men and women both discussing the topic. From there, they advertised lectures being held on in support of the Greeks. So there are pamphlets. There are, of course, lots of books on the topic being printed at the time, poetry. And so I approached it initially from a grassroots perspective. I wanted to know why people were so enthusiastic about the support for the Greeks. And in seeing their enthusiasm, that of course then led me to the next question. Well, if there's so much enthusiasm, why didn't we end up supporting independence, right? Because of course the United States doesn't. So that brought me down a whole other pathway with the government's response to the calls for Greek aid, and how they went about trying to support Greece, but while also trying to keep their options open commercially. Yeah.
Your book, which I should mention and show the audience, it's a Cornell University Press, goes into great detail as far as describing a lot of the background, and just for our own readers' sake, the Ottoman Empire was almost like a taxation sort of regime, and it was a massive real estate, right? Geographically was all over, included many countries, massive amount of territory, and there were pashas, and I believe it was the Ali Pasha in Epirus, which had jurisdiction over the Peloponnese, who was sort of, I guess, not holding the company line and doing his own thing.
Yes.
Which was the opportunity in the window for the Greek War. And I believe the population at that time was decimated, a couple million people in all of Greece, and that was sort of the window. Can you paint? And I know we had our own Revolutionary War in America, the War of 1812, the Barbary Coast Wars, the seizure, irrespective of the tribute we were paying, the seizure of American ships by pirates, Arabs, and others. So can you paint a little bit about what was going on at that time in the world as a historian that led up to this Greek fire movement?
Right. So the book, as the title says, it's the age of revolutions. And of course, there are a lot of common threads that we see in the American Revolution, and then of course later the French Revolution. But perhaps particularly with the Greek Revolution. There's revolutions, of course, also in Latin America. The Serbians also are trying to motivate towards revolution almost at about the same time. And this is an outgrowth of the Enlightenment, ideals on individual rights, equality as defined within that time, not quite how we would define equality, of course, in our modern age. But there was also this rising sense of nationalism. And I think a lot of people misunderstand what nationalism means in the context of the 19th century. Nationalism is more than just pride in one's country. It's an identity that we are a group of people with these common principles. It could be religion, ethnicity, history, or maybe a combination thereof. And through these, we constitute a nation, and we should therefore have our own nation state. And the Greek Revolution, in part, is born out of these Greek enlighteners, which I talk about briefly. But we have these Greek enlighteners being educated in universities in Europe. They, of course, are not only absorbing Enlightenment ideals, but they're also taking these ideals back to Greece with them. And from there, of course, we have the friendly brotherhood, the Philiki Etaria, that ultimately will sort of finally put that spark into the Greek Revolution itself. As far as the American story goes, we see more of the threads of nationalism emerging more out of the beginning of the 19th century, especially with the War of 1812. We defeated the British for a second time. We're kind of coming into our own. We want to be competitive on the world stage commercially. We're not going to be pushed around anymore, because of course they had been by the British, and the British, of course, also had kind of handed us over to the Barbary pirates too. We're not going to protect you guys anymore. You're not part of us. So there's this feeling of the United States wanting to be competitive on the world stage, but Americans had also recreated themselves in a sense. They have recreated a new identity that is in part founded upon the Roman Republic and on ancient Greece. So they are trying to divorce themselves from their Britishness, their British identity, and they are embracing something very new. So, or I guess, dare I say, something old, right? So they connect themselves with this ancient bloodline, even though, of course, Americans are not, there is no predominant Greek community yet in the United States in the early 19th century, let alone the late 1700s. But the source material overwhelmingly shows that Americans believed that they were connected to Greece, not just because they're engaged in their own revolution, because, and this is something I say in the book, the United States we don't see as popular of an outpouring of support for other revolutions. Sure, they support revolutions in general, they support republics, but the Greek Revolution in particular generates a lot more support, and it's a lot more long-lasting of a support throughout the 1820s because of this perceived connection and identity with the Greeks.
I've always said, metaphysically, there's a little Greek in us all as Americans, right? So,
I mean, it is, right? It's true. Yes, many aspects of our government, how we think of things, is founded at least in part in ancient ideas. Yeah.
And you actually have American ships now being sent to the Mediterranean, correct? To protect the ships and to protect our commerce. You have the French, Napoleon entering Egypt, and you have all these crazy alliances, right, over trade. Right?
And backstabbing each other too, which
constantly,
I mentioned in the book. Yeah, where Russia is supposed to be supporting. You're like, no, revolutions are bad, but at one point, the Tsar, at least under the table, supports some talks about Greek independence, even though he ends up totally backing off from that. But yes.
Yeah, but I'm going to read from your book. You said, what made supporting the Greeks exciting and attractive to the American public was that by doing so, they were, in a romantic sense, becoming part of an ancient struggle against tyranny. They connected themselves with a story containing some of the greatest heroes of all time. And I think that's exactly what you speak about as far as forging an American identity.
Yes, and of course they're also inspired by Romantic poetry, it was very popular by the 1820s. Lord Byron, of course, is the king of Romantic poetry. And so, and that's what I mean by in a romantic sense. I think a lot of Americans did not fully, I mean, most of them never are going to go to Greece, right? They don't have an intimate knowledge of what it's like to live in Greece, but they understand through their own experience with the revolution, that perceived identity, and they did honestly believe that they were linked with this ancient struggle going all the way back to the Persian Wars.
Yeah, and there's also this underlying, dichotomy between, at the time, America's mostly a Christian,
Yeah.
this Christian faith, and I think faith played a huge role in this as well, is casting, the Ottoman overlords as sort of the heathen, oppressive slave owners that they are. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so even that is a little, it's complicated because, yes, you're right. A lot of the, like the public opinion articles, the speeches that were made, in fact, a lot of churches were highly instrumental in organizing support for the Greeks. So we have a lot of references to, these are our Christian brethren, we have to support them on the basis of this, but they're also the descendants of Miltiades and Pericles, etc., and we have to support them on that level. But there's also this other thread where a lot of these, especially Christian groups, didn't think that the Greeks were the right kind of Christians, being Orthodox. So then that ignites, and there was already interest in this, but it intensifies this interest in, well, let's send missionaries to Greece. Let's help found schools. So we have this really interesting, almost missionizing spirit in terms of, well, the Greeks can't just fight the revolution on their own. They can't build a republic on their own. They need us to help them realize their full potential. So it's almost like a shade of condescension, even though they didn't mean it that way, but it certainly to our eyes comes off that way.
Yeah. And you mentioned Byron. There were so many other poets too, Percival and William Cullen Bryant, and so many other poets talking about that affinity for the Greek spirit.
When news of the Greek Revolution first arrives, and for a lot of people, in fact, there's information that I found even before the Greek Revolution. I mean, Thomas Jefferson's the best example, but there's others where people long before it are like, we really would like to see Greece become a republic. So there already was this feeling, but news arrives. For many people, they hear about it through the printing of Ypsilanti's proclamation. He's a member of the Friendly Brotherhood, essentially is part of the spark that begins the Greek Revolution. Ypsilanti's proclamation is printed throughout the United States, and it really energizes people. And so we start to see, I'd say, and I talk about it this way in the book, that the first stage of the American Philhellenic movement is, in a lot of ways, just an extension of the European movement. A lot of it is just very romanticized. There's a lot of poetry being written. We hope the Greeks are able to achieve this. There is some fundraising. Probably the biggest one that I came across was erecting a Greek cross on the Brooklyn Heights, and that happens in 1822. But it's not until 1823 where we start to see a transition towards more humanitarian efforts in actually trying to support the Greeks. And that happens largely because President James Monroe sort of loses his battle with his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who, by the way, I mean, John Quincy Adams, on a personal level, would have liked to see Greece get its independence. But on a political level and on also a personal level as being an American, did not see it being helpful for the fledgling United States that's trying to, fully come out of the War of 1812 and be competitive on the global stage. So Monroe gives his State of the Union. I think it's December 2nd, 1823. And most people know this speech because this is the Monroe Doctrine speech, where he, is talking about, Europe, you stay in your sphere, we're going to stay in our sphere. And if anybody comes over here trying to colonizing, we're going to see this as an act of aggression. But the speech actually also goes quite a bit into the Greek Revolution. And he ultimately says, well, we support the Greeks, we're not going to acknowledge independence. And it's 1 week later that Daniel Webster on the House floor says, wait a minute, we're not going to do anything about this. And I think most Americans believed that their congressmen, their senators, that they were going to be putting something together to provide aid. And that's clearly not going to happen. So that is when Webster basically mobilizes for a debate to take place in January. The House calls for documents that have been sent to the US government to be printed so that they understand the situation going on in Greece. And so then when this is printed, it becomes fully clear that not only is the United States not going to support Greek independence, but that there actually were provisional Greek officials who had been writing to the United States, to John Quincy Adams, requesting acknowledgement or assistance, and the answer has been no. So it's at that point, beginning in January of 1824, that we really start to see a mobilization for humanitarian aid.
And again, there's this dichotomy, right? Because all of these, as founding fathers of the United States, clearly were, Greek, ancient Greek and Latin were prominent. Philosophy and political science were prominent. Our whole basis of jurisprudence in this country. I know our friend John Camp is probably watching from the American School of Classical Studies, who's an expert on ancient Greek government at the time, the ecclesia, the vuli, and all that, and we're based on that. So there must have been this, it was natural to be supportive of the effort. Yet I think business interests, and you and I have talked a little bit about this, in trading with the Ottomans were of paramount importance as well, right, for our republic.
Right. Yes, and not just that the United States can benefit from trade with the Ottomans, but also because most other European powers were engaged in trade in what they call the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, port cities like Smyrna, for example. And so the United States felt that if we're going to be a major competitor, and they did not see themselves as being the same as Britain. They did not see themselves as an empire. In fact, they emphasized that. They wanted free trade. They felt that we shouldn't have to pay tributes. We should get to just do business on the basis of trade agreements. But they felt that they needed to be trying to play on the same level as these other major powers if they wanted to survive.
Yeah. And there's, I know, Maureen, you talk about them in your book, several, I call them the rock star, the American Philhellenic rock stars. And one of the most vociferous of those voices was Edward Everett. And maybe, Maria, you could show that one slide with some of these rock stars who Edward Everett was a member of Congress, a classicist, professor of Greek, a classicist, eventually became governor of the state of Massachusetts and the president of Harvard University.
Yeah, so we'll begin with Edward Everett because he is, of course, the most prominent. He attended Harvard himself.
And that's the one in the middle on the bottom row, just for the viewers.
Much later in life, of course. Yes. And in fact, for the people at home who maybe have not heard of Edward Everett was actually the guy asked to give the keynote speech at the dedication of the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was not supposed to be the keynote speech. And of course, that's the only one we know about. Nobody knows that Edward Everett actually spoke for something like 2 hours before Abraham Lincoln's very short address. But Edward Everett from Boston, graduated from Harvard, I think, in right around 1810. He wanted to not only study Greek and the ancient Greeks, but he felt in order to suitably do that, he needed to go to Europe. So he studies in Germany. He discovers that the Germans are far more devoted to studying intensively the Greek language than he was up for, which is saying something because Edward Everett certainly was an enthusiast. But in studying in Europe, he travels to London, of course. He is given letters of introduction. I believe Thomas Jefferson provides one of them. He meets Lord Byron. One of his favorite works is Childe Harold, the epic poem by Lord Byron. And in fact, Everett is in London while Parliament is debating what to do about the Elgin marbles, whether they're going to purchase them. So he was present for all of that,
Wow.
had his own personal opinions on that. He makes it to Greece, which was very uncommon for Americans. Only a handful of Americans had ever been to Greece at this point. And so he is just electrified by ancient Greece. And so he returns to Harvard and is given a special professorship to teach Greece, the Greek language, Greek culture. But he also, the position also entailed that he was to help educate the community on ancient Greece. So he did public talks and all that sort of stuff. So he has a very intimate reason and personal reason for why he's going to become a Philhellene. And of course, he's got all these connections that's going to help him be a major leader. I think
and Maureen, the irony of ironies is it's his classmate, right? John
yes.
Bethune English.
George Bethune English.
George
Yeah.
Bethune English, who's sort of the Benedict Arnold of Philhellenism, right? You could talk a little bit about him too.
Yeah, and since you bring him up, so introducing George Bethune English, who I'm sure we'll come back to, they were classmates, graduated roughly around the same time. They both received the highest award that a graduating classmate could receive from Harvard at the time. And so they definitely knew each other. I actually went to Harvard. I looked at the records that Harvard keeps. They keep records on all their students. And I saw George Bethune English's folder. And it's really hard to piece this guy together. He studied theology. He was, for all intents and purposes, he was going to be a minister.
Right.
And then something happens and he has this intense religious doubt. And at first, he completely rejects Christianity and believes himself to be perhaps more in line with Judaism. But in rejecting the divinity of Christ, he's excommunicated from his church in Cambridge. He's kind of persona non grata. He published a work, I think it was self-published, actually, condemning Christianity. He's very combative in his language, like, let any man stand up and show me hard and fast proof that Christianity is correct. And Edward Everett is the one that's going to step up to the plate. So he prints his response. And so they have this very public debate. And ultimately, English, and I really tried to find more information on him because he is such an interesting character, but for whatever reason, he decides to join the United States Marines, probably because, again, he's persona non grata, I'm guessing. So he goes off with the Marines. He ends up in the Mediterranean, and this is like the 18 teens. And again, I don't know why. I don't know what led him to this decision. Other contemporaries write about him being in the Mediterranean, but they don't say what happens. But he ends up in Egypt. He relinquishes his commission with the Marines, and it joins the Egyptian army and becomes an artillerist, and in fact, like an officer in the Egyptian army. and supposedly converted to Islam and took the name Muhammad Effendi as his Muslim name. So he eventually will end up back in the United States right at the time that the Greek Revolution is starting. He is familiar with Ottoman officials, including the official who is the Capudan Pasha. At this point, he's the commander of the Ottoman Navy. And he basically applies for this job to the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, and says, listen, I have all these inside contacts. If you want an audience to discuss a commercial treaty, I'm your man. So Adams gives him the job. And he is off to Constantinople, while Edward Everett, his former classmate, is mobilizing efforts to help the revolution against the Ottomans. Everett is desperate to be an agent to the Greeks. And here, again, this is backroom dealing. John Quincy Adams is going, well, we can't send an agent to Greece because I've got this other guy, the secret agent, who's trying to wheel and deal in Constantinople right now. And if I send an agent to Greece, the Sultan's going to be like, what the heck? How serious are you about making an alliance with us? So it becomes messy right away.
We definitely have a mini series here somewhere. So,
right, yeah.
Sort of a Lawrence of Arabia, Ottoman Empire. So on the top, we have to the right on the.
So Jonathan Peckham Miller ends up joining. He actually is sponsored by the Greek Committee of, I think it's New York. I could be wrong about that. It's either New York or Philadelphia. And they help him get to Greece. He arrives in Greece, I believe in 1824. Then and actually he joins because Lord Byron by 1824 has enlisted into the Greek army as well. Samuel Gridley Howe, who is from Boston, he of course lives a very important life as an American reformer later on. But at this time, in 1824, he's just graduated from medical school. He's very young. He is caught up in the Greek fire, as many of the newspapers called it, and hence why the title of my book. And he wants to join the Greek army, but he has to sell it to his parents that, oh, I'm going to get lots of on-the-job experience being a doctor on the battlefield. That's really why I'm going. But I mean, maybe it was a little column A, a little column B, I don't know. So he will go to Greece. He arrives sometime around January of 1825. And then there's actually another American, there's several Americans serving the Greek army, but the other one that's really important, I don't think you have a picture of it, I don't know if there is one that exists, is George Jarvis.
Yes.
Who was a son of a New York merchant who actually grew up in, I think, Denmark. But he ends up going and serving in the Greek army as well. And so Miller, Howe, and Jarvis, the three of them, are sponsored by American Philhellenic societies. So they sent letters to them. Those letters were printed in the newspapers. That was their mobilizing arm to get aid and supplies sent over to Greece.
Yeah. And then to the top right of the viewers is of course, Daniel Webster.
Yeah, again, later in life.
Yeah. And on the bottom left is an amazing character for our friends from Philadelphia. It's George Mifflin Dallas, who was not only the mayor of Philadelphia, but became, I think, the governor and also the vice president of the United States of America. And to the right, bottom right, the stately fellow with the beautiful white beard is the poet, the great poet William Cullen Bryant. And maybe, Maria, you can show a little bit of his poem that was presented. There's a slide of there we go. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that and a little bit about, there's so many of these incredible figures that are highlighted in your book and featured in your book, but maybe you could talk a little bit about this one.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, because I initially approached things from a more grassroots approach, and this was something I came up against with my my work into the first federal Congress, I didn't get to know, if you will, a lot of the characters that are involved in the story. So with this one, it was really exciting because there were a lot of high-profile individuals involved in the movement, and we know a lot about these individuals. So through that, it really, I think, humanized it, made it more dramatic, in fact. So this image is the front page of a piece of music that was composed by, I forget what his first name is now, but it's Ives. This is out of the Philadelphia Conservatory, or the Musical Seminary. And he set to music this popular poem written in the 1820s by William Cullen Bryant called the Song of the Greek Amazon. And the image above shows this Greek Amazon. So it's a story about a Greek maiden whose fiance has been killed in battle, in the Greek Revolution. And because of this loss, she herself takes on the scimitar, as the poem says. She is going to become a clef to this, a Greek soldier, in effect. And she is going to join the ranks of the Greek army herself. And I go into a little bit just the logistics of that. There were women who served in the Greek army. This would have been certainly in the United States sort of unimaginable for a woman to serve in the Greek army at the time, or in the U.S. Army. But they sort of saw it as justified that the loss of her fiance at the hands of the Turks justified this drastic decision to become a soldier herself. And a lot of the poetry is along those lines. And as you said, there are other important poets. There's another one I mention in the book that's the woman, it's a woman, her name's Eliza Snow. She actually ends up becoming an important figure in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But of course, that's much later down the road for her. So in her youth, she was a philhellene writing poems like this.
Yep. What was stunning to me and revealing in your book were the number of these Greek committees: the Greek Committee of Philadelphia, the Greek Committee of Boston, the Greek Committee of Poughkeepsie and Utica, and on and on and on. And then you actually, thank you for all your research, but you actually talk about some of these efforts from, one night in Savannah, they raised $350, and Cheraw, South Carolina, $225, and St. Petersburg, and the hundreds of articles in this whole huge grassroots movement that I think to us as Greek Americans, that had nothing to do with Greeks, Greek Americans really, yeah. But there were just hundreds of them, and a lot of them having events around Washington's birthday, which at the time we celebrate it today, but I mean, as a holiday, it's a big deal back then. And you even said that the General Society of Mechanics in New Haven, Connecticut raised $50, and $50 back then, that went a long way. Can you talk a little bit about these grassroots movements, because there's just a plethora of them? I
did research. Again, my first stop, I did the newspapers. A lot of those are digitized, so it's very accessible. But I wanted to see. I didn't want it just to be these sort of faceless groups of people. I wanted to try and see who actually is involved in all of this. So I did research at the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the American Antiquarian Society in Massachusetts. I went to Boston. I went to the New York Historical Society, and they actually have, I came across several collections, and again, it's so funny what people decide to keep and what they decide not to keep. But just for example, the New York Historical Society has in a collection under it George Newbold, who was a banker. I think he's one of the founding members of the Bank of America. He was given the task of keeping the records of all of the donations made for the New York Greek Society. And the New York Society became the National Society. And I'm not sure how that decision came about. I didn't come up with that information. But nationally, people sent their monies to New York, and then they would collect them all together, and then they were sent from there. So George Newbold kept receipts, and those receipts, a lot of them still exist. And I mean, we're talking, John Smith from such and such little town sent $5, and it's on a receipt, it's in this folder. So, I mean, and there's hundreds of these things, men and women. Even there were several from like Virginia, for example, and at least two that I can think of off the top of my head, where not only they say, please send this money to New York. Actually, one was they sent it to Edward Everett and said, send this to wherever it needs to go. So they obviously knew who Edward Everett was. But then they kind of lament, we don't have a Greek society in our little town, so that's why I'm sending it up to New York. And it's a good thing you did, because we have the receipt, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, hundreds upon hundreds of these receipts that give us a little taste of the people. And like you were mentioning from the book, I mean, it's not just elites who have nothing better to do but go to these lectures. I mean, there were barbers who devoted the proceeds of their earnings for one day to the Greek cause, mechanics, shipbuilders. I mean, it was far-reaching.
It's very moving, actually. And I mean, and you even talked about a sewing bee, where women were sewing clothes and sending like 500 pairs of whatever, trousers or
one
kids'
group
clothes.
supposedly made 3,000 garments.
Wow.
I think that was a little town in New York, if memory serves.
That's really neat. Let's shift gears, because what's even more fascinating, other than the help, was the light that this shed on what was happening here at home in America. And in your book, you said the role the American Philhellenic movement played in America reform movements of the antebellum era was through its proven effective rhetoric and public appeal. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And another quote was that in your concluding remarks in your book was the antebellum reform movements absorbed some of the rhetoric Philhellenes employed, especially in regard to Ottoman slavery and the subjugation of women under the empire, in order to build a more powerful and influential argument for their causes.
So the intention for the Philhellenic movement was never for it to be part of the reform movement per se in the United States. I mean, it starts off as this movement that uniquely brings the North and South together. Now, we have to understand that this is the climate domestically is the Missouri Compromise of 1820 has just taken place. This is where Maine becomes an independent state from it. And for maybe people who don't know, Maine used to be part of Massachusetts. I don't know if everybody knows that, but it enters into the Union as a separate state when Missouri enters into the Union, and it's because Missouri enters into the Union as a slave state. And so there's this concern about balancing congressional power between slave and free states. So slavery is
I think that the Northwest Ordinance too, which banned it.
Yeah, yes.
That kicks in around the same time, right? Yeah, west, right.
North of, I think, 3630. Yeah.
Right.
So, right. So, slavery is emerging as a major sectional problem in the United States. But the Greek Revolution sort of brings the country together in a lot of ways. Everybody shares in the sentiment that, of course we love the Greeks. And there's this sentiment going back to the Barbary Wars. And actually even before that, there's material of these captive tales where American sailors, going back to the 1780s, had been captured by Barbary pirates, kept as slaves until ransom money was received. Their tales were printed as books, and there's lots of them. This is a whole genre of literature, the captivity tales. So there was already this feeling that the Turks are the exact opposite of what we are as the United States. They are the embodiment of tyranny, and the Greeks, because we share this ancient connection with them, we need to support them. And so there's this national mobilization on those grounds. It's not until the late 1820s, right around 1827, when once again we see this resurgence in enthusiasm for the Greek cause, actually 1826 even. And one of the first works I came across is by David Walker, who was a Black abolitionist. And he writes in this scathing condemnation of gradual emancipation. He was a proponent of immediatism, immediate abolition of slavery in the United States. And he says, I'm reading the newspaper. I see these articles talking about the Turks are these hateful slave traders, and they have the Greeks as slaves, and isn't this terrible? And then right down below it is an article advertising for the sale of a slave here in the United States. And how do you people not see the hypocrisy of that? William Lloyd Garrison, who becomes a very important abolitionist in the antebellum period, he's a young man at this point. In fact, he really wanted to go to Greece to become a soldier in the Greek army himself. But doesn't do that. But instead, we see his Philhellenism in his early abolitionist speeches, where he also is drawing that connection. So the rhetoric of the Philhellenic movement begins to take on almost a different life form. And because it was so popular, and in fact, they even explicitly say this, I think, in Frederick Douglass's newspapers.
Yes.
We would do well to pay attention to the use of the Greek Revolution and the enslavement of the Greeks and adopt it as part of our rhetoric to try and get people to realize that there is no difference between slavery in Greece and slavery within our own borders. And so that's when we start to see, like, by the beginning of the 1830s, there's, obviously, Southerners are not going to see it that way. Right. Also will have a part in the abolitionist movement. Photius Fisk is one, John Zachos, Lucas Miller as well. In fact, they're adopted by our Philhellenic friends we introduced just a bit ago. Samuel Gridley Howe brings John Zachos back. A missionary brings Photius Fisk back. And then it's, of course, not his last name, that he takes that name from the missionary. And Lucas Miller takes his name from Jonathan Peckham Miller. So they, in experiencing the Greek Revolution and seeing the horrors of slavery, they become abolitionists themselves and draw those comparisons between their experiences and slavery in the United States.
Why don't you describe that a little bit?
Yeah.
And it's kind of hard to see, but you can see, again, we're going back to a time where this was scandalous, actually, to see something like this with the sensibilities at the time. You could see some of the women portrayed there that had 50 layers of clothes and corsets and what have you. And then you have this young, beautiful Greek slave, basically, a young girl who's shackled, and you can't see it really, but there's a cross. There's also a cross at the end of that chain.
Right. Yeah. It's resting on the top of the auction block where her hands are. A lot of people don't realize, but art was not something that was prevalently on display in the United States. I mean, museums, art museums. I mean, this is really early on where, and I'm not to say that there were none existed, but certainly Americans did not have access to the world of art like we have today. And there are also, of course, taboo subjects. So even though Americans profess to be lovers of Greece and Rome, they were not lovers of the classical nude statue per se. This is sort of a scandalous sort of thing. So the Greek Slave is a work by Hiram Powers, an American artist who studied in Italy. And he created the Greek Slave as a reminder of the Greek Revolution, the enthusiasm that people had for it, and of course the imagery of it. This young Greek woman who is about to be auctioned off to the highest bidder on an Ottoman auction block. She is, downcast, demure, and it was said that it was socially acceptable to go see this statue, partly because of the subject matter, because she is unwillingly naked, but also that she is clothed in her own sort of sense of self, her sense of Christianity, her sense of innocence. And so it was the first nude statue ever put on display in the United States. It arrives in New York in 1847, and it toured the United States, and it was a big deal. My book mentions one of the opening displays of it. A journalist goes to write a review, and he's excited to see it, and he's surveying the crowd, and he's wondering if there's going to be any prudes in the crowd, if anybody's going to be scandalized. And he says, well, I only saw one prude, so that's good. But everybody else, overwhelmingly, the reaction is just horror, sadness for the loss of this young woman's innocence. And almost immediately, it travels to Boston afterwards. An abolitionist, Lucy Stone, sees the statue, and supposedly, according to her, she burst into tears because not only does she recognize, of course, the imagery going back to the enthusiasm for the Philhellenic movement, but also that here is a woman who's been enslaved, and this is no different than slavery as it exists within the United States itself. Lucy Stone also, in seeing this, was struck by the fact that it's a woman. She supposedly, in seeing the statue, becomes determined to also speak on women's rights issues. And so she becomes an early proponent for women's rights, which is really mobilizing in the late 1840s as well.
The lithograph above is from our friends at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And the actual statue below, and probably we'll do an event there with you, is it used to be at the Corcoran and now at the National Gallery of Art here in Washington, D.C. But these are sort of striking pieces of art. And at the same time, I think there's Delacroix. Was it Delacroix? There's some oil paintings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the image on the top is actually an image of the Greek slave on display at the Crystal Palace in London. It's in the American exhibit. Really quickly, the Crystal Palace was this great exhibition of the industrialized parts of the world. This was, of course, put on by Prince Albert in particular, but the Americans had an exhibit. And they were so proud of this statue that, and by the way, there were several copies of it. So one of these copies is sent to be a part of this exhibit. And it also generates much debate, even in London, not because the statue is nude or anything, but the abolitionist societies in London say, hold on a minute. How can you guys, in all seriousness, include this in your display, but you have slavery? And in fact, I think that's another image we have, the part of the commentary coming up. Former slave, a black slave here in the United States, of course, even if you got your freedom, you ran away, you went to the North, This is, of course, in the midst of, this would have been the early 1850s. So this is after the Compromise of 1850, which included the Fugitive Slave Act, which basically, if you were in the North and you knew of someone as being a runaway slave, you had to, by federal law, return that slave to their masters under the penalty of a very severe fine. So running away to the North did not make you safe. So a lot of these slaves either made their way to Canada, or in this case, this guy makes his way to London. And he goes to the Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace. And he supposedly took this image, which was printed in the Punch magazine, and made a big deal about putting it on the statue as like condemning American slavery for what it is, and how hypocritical they are in including that in their display.
Yeah, and you can see at the pedestal, it says El Pluribus Unum, which is
E Pluribus Unum,
our motto. And then you could talk a little bit about the statue to the right, Xenobia.
Yeah, so Xenobia in Chains is a work by a female artist, an American artist by the name of Harriet Hosmer. She also was trained in Europe, and her pieces tend to have political motivation behind them, and she was very much a part of the women's rights movement, which is emerging by the 1850s. And she had patronesses, if you will, that were part of the abolitionist societies and women's rights circles. And they wanted her to create a response to the Greek slave. So they felt the Greek slave is too demure, that women should show self-assurance even in situations as extreme as becoming a slave. So Xenobia is or was a queen of Palmyra during the Hellenistic period. She was captured by the Romans, and so this statue is capturing that moment when she has been now enslaved, and her body language, her stance, it's all intended to be the exact opposite of the Greek slave, that she's holding the chains in her hands, but if she were able to, she might tear them apart in her own hands if she could.
Quoting a famous woman, you could tell us a little bit about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who says, "Custom forbids a woman in the Ottoman Empire to enter a mosque or call the hour of prayer. Here, in the United States, it forbids her a voice in the church councils or state legislatures. The same taint of her primitive state of slavery affects both latitudes." And that's quite a statement.
Yeah, so again, I mean, that's very similar rhetoric that was used during the Philhellenic movement of the 1820s, where, again, the Ottomans are the ultimate oppressors, the ultimate tyrants, and this is why we should support the Greeks. And I saw this thread carrying forward throughout the decades in the 19th century and even coming into the early 20th century, where they're still using that rhetoric as a way to call attention to hypocrisy as it exists in the United States. So, the Ottoman Turks do this to women. Well, their situation here isn't necessarily a lot better, right? And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote that in the History of the Women's Suffrage, printed in the 1880s. So, I mean, this is 60 years later, and they're still talking about these references.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We have a comment about translating the book into Greek, so maybe that's going to be our next. That's a good idea.
It actually is going to be translated into Greek.
Oh, wonderful!
Yeah, Cornell has already negotiated a contract with a Greek publisher, and from what I understand, it will be available perhaps maybe later this year. I'm not sure about a specific date, but it is translated.
It's very good news. So, any final thoughts that you want to share with us? I want to thank you because this has opened up a whole universe of ideas and ignited us as you know, this year is the 200th year anniversary celebration of the Greek War of Independence, and the National Hellenic Society is particularly interested in this Philhellenic movement. And I stumbled upon your doctoral dissertation, which led me to the book. And I think, I hope this is the beginning of a new romance between the NHS and Professor Santelli in terms of spreading some of these ideas in your book and the impact in the United States, which is it's so important, I think, especially now, as we went through our own summer of inquiry into our own history, and
Yeah.
I think it's important. So, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think I would like to end maybe with probably the most favorite thing that I found when I was going through the sources. I think the thing that excited me the most was coming across the memoirs printed for Samuel Gridley Howe in the beginning of the 20th century, and his good friend, Franklin Benjamin Sanborn, writes the foreword. He introduces the book essentially. And I provide a little bit of background on him. A lot of people aren't familiar with him, but Sanborn, Howe, and others were part of the so-called Secret Six, who had basically helped fundraise John Brown's insurrection at Harper's Ferry. And so they very much are part of this radical abolitionist group. And in writing the foreword to this book, he says of Howe that Howe understood that freedom sometimes comes at a price. You have to fight for it, and that he ultimately says that the anti-slavery cause in the 19th century had begun in Greece and culminated in our American Civil War. So for Franklin Benjamin Sanborn, the Howe's role in the Greek Revolution and the impact that it had on the United States was that important, at least in Sanborn's mind.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's very inspiring words to live by. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah.
We hope to invite you to our annual event. So thank you very, very much, Dr. Santelli, for your work, and look forward to meeting you in person soon.